When looking back at our childhoods, it is oftentimes like birthdays and Christmases that stand out in our minds. Many of us look back on the gifts we received on those days as particularly special. I know I can personally pick out a few gifts my parents gave me while I was growing up that helped define me as I grew into adulthood. I also, like many others, can look back on my life and see the sacrifices my parents made as gifts that aided me in my future. I can also see in new ways how God, like my parents and other loved ones, has passed on his own gifts to raise me up and aid me in doing his work. Yet, unlike the physical gifts of Christmas morning or birthdays, the gifts that God gives are spiritual. Today we'll be talking about these gifts. As with anything concerning the Holy Spirit, there can be a great deal of confusion surrounding the gifts and their use. So I'll be doing my best today to provide a brief definition of what the gifts are, their history, and how they function. So what are spiritual gifts? To put it simply, spiritual gifts are abilities given by God to aid in and in accomplishing his purpose on the earth. These gifts are administered and maintained through contact with the Holy Spirit. The gifts were foretold in the book of Joel and were provided after the death of Jesus when God provided his church with the Holy Spirit. These gifts can be seen at work throughout the New Testament and form an essential part of the ministry of the early church, on which our own churches are based. However, just because these gifts have been present since Jesus' sacrifice on the cross doesn't mean that they have always been utilized. On the contrary, for a large part of the history of the church, the spiritual gifts were all but forgotten. This was due in large part to neglect on the part of the Catholic Church, and then outright denial during the Reformation, which birthed cessationist theology. The idea was first developed by John Calvin and has since evolved into many different interpretations, yet the core idea stays the same, that certain spiritual gifts, particularly the more supernatural ones, ceased to be given by God to the church sometime late in the 1st century after Christ's death. On the other side of the spectrum is continuationism, which upholds that the gifts of the Spirit are still given by God. This group counts all Pentecostals and Charismatics in its ranks, and forms the backbone of the charismatic revival that has swept the world in the last century. As I stated previously, Pentecostalism was formed on the basis of replicating the ministry of the early church. The forefathers of the movement saw that the Holy Spirit and the gifts he provided were essential to the growth and health of the early church, and after seeking these gifts for themselves, found them to be instrumental in their own ministries as well. Now, let's look more specifically at the spiritual gifts themselves. Typically, when thinking about spiritual gifts, many parse through a list of about 18 to 21 of them without referencing the verses or passages where they are mentioned. I, however, feel it is more helpful to look at these gifts in the light of the Trinity. If we look at 1 Corinthians 12, verses 4 through 6, we can see that there are different gifts, ministries, and ways of working given by the Spirit, Son, and Father, respectively. With this in mind, we can group spiritual gifts into 3 groups: gifts of the Spirit, gifts of the Son, and gifts of the Father. First, we'll be looking at gifts of the Spirit as described in 1 Corinthians 12, verses 7 through 11. These gifts are wisdom, knowledge, faith, healing, miracles, prophecy, discernment, tongues, and interpretation. We are each created uniquely, and in turn manifest each of these gifts in different ways. While tongues is the initial evidence of baptism in the Holy Spirit and should be pursued by all members of the church, the other gifts on this list vary from person to person. It is important to remember that no gift is more valuable than any other. All are equally important. The second group of gifts are the gifts of the Son, as described in Ephesians 4, verse 11. These are the gifts given by Jesus and include apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds, and teachers. These gifts aren't manifestations of various abilities, but rather people that God gives to raise up and gives over to build up the church. God has created all of us to be one of these people and to fill one of these roles within the church. With this in mind, the calling of the church extends far past the pastor to each and every member of the congregation. The last set of gifts are the gifts of the Father as listed in Romans 12, verses 6 through 8. These gifts are perceiving, serving, teaching, encouraging, giving, leading, and mercy. These gifts are offered as we offer ourselves as living sacrifices to God, the Father. They are behaviors that encourage us to resist the patterns of this world and be transformed into new people with new patterns. These gifts can be viewed as natural strengths inherent in each of us that God is able to use for His good purposes. After hearing all of this, you might be wondering what your own spiritual gifts are. Unfortunately, I can't tell you. Finding your gifts is a personal process that involves evaluating your own strengths as you mature in the faith. I would encourage you to speak with your pastor or other faith leaders if you are interested in finding what gifts God has given you. Thank you so much for watching this short lecture. I hope this has helped you find clarity on this important topic.